Thank you all. Okay, so we're going to pick up where we left off. I was hopeful, in one sense, that the feds would not issue some guidance. They did. They issued 124 pages of regulations yesterday. I have not completed reading them yet. I'm on page 88, only my first run through. A lot of details, a lot of things that are surprising us in the federal regs, and they're called temporary regs. Whether they revise them again, I don't know. I haven't seen any forms yet other than the employment posters for the federal law. So we'll talk about what we know. There's more we don't know. Obviously, we have to digest all this information. The day before that, they released another 65 pages of what they call guidance, which is on top of the regs. And I have scanned through that, but a lot of issues here. And if you feel overwhelmed, yes, that's a fair statement for all of us, and we're all basically in the same predicament. A few things to update you on my presentation from last time. We, believe it or not, they're updates just from earlier this week. In addition to, I told you about the Onondaga County executive order that had expired that has been renewed. They created an exception to the, if you're being tested for COVID, you got to stay at home. There's a medical treatment exception, which wasn't there before. We now have new county orders up in Orange, Rockland, and Westchester County. So we're starting to see the county execs take a more aggressive stance towards this and enact their own executive orders. There was a second executive order in Onondaga County, and I point this out because I think it's going to be a sign of things to come. You probably are aware of individuals violating the don't get together ban, the keep socially isolated. Our county exec has now criminalized it and enacted an emergency local law to allow arrests in that situation. So I think that's a sign of things to come in that regard. Okay, so let's pick up with the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. Basically, it's a federal paid sick leave act and an emergency extension of FEMLA. Some of the FEMLA stuff will continue to apply. Some of it is being turned on its head in that regard. So it's a new set of rules. Again, the 124 pages of regulations on top of the probably 100 pages of guidance that existed before that. It's a lot. And the best I can tell you right now is we're going to have to work the question. So we're going to have to analyze the question, the specific question that you posed based on the specific information of your company, right down to number count, based onto the employee, and we got to grant the employee the greatest benefit under the federal statute or the state statute. So it does not lend itself to quick answers, is my point, and don't be surprised in that regard. Okay, so what we have, basically the same day that the state COVID sick leave statute was passed, President Trump signed the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, FFCRA will be referred to throughout this. It became effective on April 1. There was some dispute about that initially. We had calculated it April 2nd. Others calculated it April 1. The Department of Labor basically said it's April 1. So that's where we're going to apply it. The COVID Sick Leave Act in New York had an effective date of March 18th. So there's going to be some people covered by one, and then we'll come into the other. There are two main parts of the federal law. One is the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. You're going to see things very similar to what I went over with the New York State COVID Sick Leave Act. I will warn you right now, the definition of subject to a quarantine or isolation order under federal law is much, much broader than I went over earlier in this presentation under state law. So when we get to that, I will read you what it is. If you remember, I told you I did not think the governor's executive orders on the 50%, 75%, and 100% non-essential workforce reductions qualified as a mandatory order of quarantine under state law. I believe that to be the case. It will qualify under federal law. I don't really have much doubt in that regard. So you're going to see the federal law, surprisingly, is going to be broader on the subject than the state law. The other thing that you're running into, the other practical problem that's going on out there, is this question of unemployment. Yeah, it's not really part of these two laws. It was another one. There will be individuals making more money on unemployment than they would have been working for you. That is an accurate statement. We've done the numbers, and it's clear that that's going to be many individuals that you have laid off. It is going to make it difficult for you to bring them back to work prior to July 31, when this enhanced $600 ultimately will end. But, you know, you're going to have, this too will pass. It's just a question of when, and then we're going to have to try to get them back to work. Okay, so again, the first part is the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, and then we have the Emergency Family and Medical Leave Expansion Act. You're going to have to undo some of the things that you know about FEMLA. Well, FEMLA, that's not going to apply to me. I have less than 50 employees. Surprise, it's going to apply to you. So some of the concepts will come through. However, some of the concepts you're going to have to relearn. And remember, this is only a temporary, these are temporary laws that will ultimately expire unless renewed by the federal government. So we'll see how this goes as we progress throughout the year. So the first part of the law that I wanted to talk to you about is the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. This applies to all covered employers. Now, in the private sector, what this is going to mean is employers with fewer than 500. So let's start there. I have multiple entities. Yeah, we're going to have to look at the control of those entities. We're going to have to look at, you know, is it really one entity or is it multiple entities? Do we consider it one entity or multiple entities? And we'll have to go through the analysis to figure that out. Will I include independent contractors? No, you will not. Will I include temporaries and part-times? Yes, you will. In that regard. It's a little different than what we typically see in employment law. Typically, we see, like for FEMLA. FEMLA applies to 50 or more employers with, employers with more than 50 employees, and to the public sector. That is a little different here. It's a less than in that regard. You're going to see in a second that there is a ability of a small company, because a small company may have to pay a lot of money under this law, to basically self-exempt itself out and say, if I have less than 50 employees, basically this is going to put me out of business if I have to pay this money, and I am exempting myself from this law. It's basically my first read through of it. It's a self-exemption. But you do have to do an analysis, and you have to have the materials ready in case your employee confronts you on it. And the employee would then have the right to file a claim with the United States Department of Labor, Wage and Hour, in the event you don't give the benefits. So you're going to have to do this analysis. Don't automatically think, I have less than 50 employees, I'm exempt. It doesn't work that way. You have to do an analysis and then exempt yourself. Oh, that's no big deal, Mike. It'll take me 10 minutes. No, it's going to take some time based on what I've read. You really have to get your ducks in a row if you're going to do this. Mike, it doesn't seem fair that employers with more than 500 employees are exempt from this law. I didn't write it, but that is correct. They have no responsibility under this law. I think the reasoning is they have more lucrative leave packages. They can better handle the financial hardship that is being imposed upon them. Whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent, I don't know. I'm just explaining it. Even if you have more than 500 employees, the New York State COVID sick leave law will apply to you. And you need to remember that and keep that in mind as you go through. So you always have this interplay between the federal law and the state law. You always have to grant the employee the greatest right under whichever law is, assuming you're covered by both. If you are not covered by the federal law, don't worry about it. Don't waste your time trying to understand the ins and outs of it, because you simply will not have to. As an aside, just for a second, on the COVID sick leave, we are now seeing disputes arise between employers and their carrier. If you have these multiple corporations set up, is it really one company or not one company? The insurance carriers are trying to make it so if you have more than 100 employees, they're sort of off the hook on the COVID sick leave, and it's really on you, the employer, to pay it. So you better have your ducks in a row there as well, and make sure you understand what your policy says, what you signed when you submitted your application becomes very important in this area. So keep that in mind as well. So again, covered employer, employers with fewer than 500, turning to the public sector, employers with one or more employees. So basically, if you're in the public sector, you're going to be covered, and it includes public agencies in that regard. Meeting the 500 employee threshold test, there's a fair amount of guidance that the U.S. Department of Labor has published on this, and if you need the details, the detailed guidance, let me know, and I will simply email it to you. Basically, what the statute does is it adopts the Fair Labor Standards Act Joint Employer Test. Not a surprise. Why? Because this law is being enforced by the U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour. That's their test. The Joint Employment Test is interpreted fairly broadly by the Department of Labor. Now, there are 4 factors that the department generally considers to determine whether a joint employer is directly or indirectly controlling an employee. The 4 factors that are used to determine this: who hires or fires the employee. Some of you have multiple entities. The employees might work for multiple entities. They're going to look at, is there one HR person? Is it the same owner? Who has the authority to carry out the hiring and firing determination? Is it the same, or is it the same staff? And that would basically be something they're going to take a look at. Supervises and controls the employee's work, schedule, or conditions of employment to a substantial degree. In essence, this is going to be the authority. Where does it rest? Who does the supervising? Who does the controlling? It's very fact intensive, and some facts can easily tip the scale one way or another. Who determines the employee's rate and method of payment, and who maintains the employment records? If you can establish that these 4, the majority of these 4 things are in your favor, you're probably dealing with 2 separate and distinct entities. One of the things that I want you to remember: unintended consequences. Make sure you're happy with how you're counting your employees, because if you're counting them one way for purposes of this new federal law, make sure that that is consistent with how you're counting it other ways. If you suddenly create these inconsistencies in the counting of your employees, that might be problematic for you in other areas. It simply depends, all the way down to workers' compensation coverage, what have you represented to your carriers, and things like that. So that is the general test that the U.S. Department of Labor will apply in this area. Entitlement to leave. Employers must provide paid sick leave to an employee who's unable to work or telework. And that's the key thing there, unable to work or telework due to a qualifying need for leave. Now, you're about to see as we go over the qualifying need for the leave, it's going to be much broader than exists under state law. And remember, if you're covered by both, the employee gets the broader of the two laws. So the first one I'll spend a few minutes on, reasons for leave when you're dealing with the employee's own condition. The employee is subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order related to COVID-19. Now, I haven't seen per se a federal order yet. I believe now that the governor's executive orders may qualify as a state order. Earlier in this presentation on day one, I went through a local quarantine order, both from the county executive, and I think I gave you one from Washington County. I've also learned New York City is giving out individual orders as well. And all local departments of health are authorized to do so, and they have 30 days to do so from the receipt of all the materials. What I wanted to read, and again, these slides were prepared before the regulations came out yesterday. So what is subject to a quarantine or isolation order mean for purposes of the federal law? Earlier in this presentation on the first day, we went through what it meant on the state law with the best information that we had up to date. Now we have the federal definition, and it's broader than the state definition. So for purposes of the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, a quarantine or isolation order includes the following: quarantine, isolation, containment, shelter in place, or stay-at-home orders issued by any federal, state, or local government authority. Okay, that cause the employee to be unable to work even though his or her employer has work for that the employee could perform, but for that order. So they basically can't get to work. Now, the telework will be an issue here. Can they work from home in that regard? The subject to a quarantine or isolation order continues. This also includes any federal, state, or local government authority when a federal, state, or local government authority has advised categories of citizens. For example, citizens of certain age ranges or certain medical conditions to shelter in place, stay at home, isolate, or quarantine, causing those categories of employees to be unable to work even though their employers have worked for them. Now, some of you have heard of, and I may have mentioned it at the last presentation, this Matilda's law that the governor announced at his press conference some weeks ago. When it was announced, we're like, well, wait a minute, where's the text of the law? When was it voted on? When did you sign it? Well, we looked into it. There is no law. There was no bill that was passed by the Senate or the Assembly. There was no bill signed into law. So that was number one. So the next thing we're like, oh, so he must have issued an executive order outlining this, and he's just calling it a law. We looked. No, that doesn't exist either. What it was, during one of his daily press conferences, that Governor Cuomo announced this Matilda's law. And I, for the life of me, said, well, what is it then? And you look on the governor's website, it is referred to as guidance. And I'm not quite sure it's enforceable against employers. However, the Department of Labor in New York is accepting complaints for anyone that violates Matilda's law in sum and substance, even though it's not really a law. The other thing that we are seeing is law enforcement now being more active, and law enforcements are being given little checklists and cheat sheets for what they can enforce, what they can't enforce. Matilda's law is on some of these. We've got a hold of a few of them, and I'm like, wow, that's interesting. So I'm not sure. I think the second category is talking about this Matilda's law. Basically, employees 70 or older, stay at home, don't go to work. And I think you as employers, I just want you to be cautious that if you have those employees that are ages 70 or older or have conditions, be cognizant. Should I be making them come in? I know what Mike said. It's not a law. It's not an executive order, but you still have to fight them in case they start arresting you for violations of it. So very broad, expansive reading of what that is, much broader than under state law. So that is the first reason for qualifying leave under the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. The second reason is the employee has been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine due to concerns related to COVID-19. That in and of itself is not enough under state law, but it is enough under federal law. So be aware the employee basically has a medical note. I need to self-quarantine because my doctor has said so, and it's due to concerns over COVID-19. So in this case, under state law, a medical note is not enough. Now, under federal law, it is going to be. And some of you are probably like, well, how do I figure this out? You do the analysis. We will analyze what your obligations are under state law. You will analyze what your obligations are under federal law, both of these parts, and you will grant the employee the largest right. That is what it is. Don't think of it as a big, oh my God, I got to figure it out altogether. No, I want you to figure it out piece by piece by piece, just like we did before any of this broke. We had short-term disability, workers' comp, human rights law, ADA, family and medical leave. We figured out what the employee's greatest right is, and we gave them that right under that statute. It's no different, folks. It's no different. It's just new, and it's being thrown at us very quickly. I think that is the main reason why. So again, number two, much broader, does not exist under state law, but does exist under federal law. Number three, the employee is experiencing symptoms of COVID-19 and is seeking medical diagnosis. So this is even one step further removed. The employee calls you and says, I'm not feeling well. I'm going to try to see my doctor. I have COVID-19-like symptoms. And, you know, I went over what the symptoms are last time. It can be lots of different things, from bronchitis to the regular flu to other things. We don't know. So the employee is triggering the statute just with that at the end of the day. So be cognizant. Again, it's pretty broad, the approach the feds took to that. So it's one of those three reasons for the employee's own condition. What are the reasons for leave under the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act when caring for others? Okay. The employee is caring for an individual who is, number one, subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order. I've read to you that definition. Has been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine due to concerns related to COVID-19. Or number three, the employee is caring for a child whose school or place of care is closed or whose child care provider is unavailable due to COVID-19 precautions. Now, in the new regulations that we have, let me just read something to you. And I do sort of apologize. Usually I have all my slides nice, as most of you know, but they just threw all this at us, and we have a lot to learn in a very short period of time. So what the law does define a child care provider now. So I thought this was a good definition. A child care provider means a provider who receives compensation for providing child care services on a regular basis. The terms includes a center-based child care provider, a group home child care provider, a family child care provider, or other provider of child care services for compensations that is licensed, regulated, or registered under state law and satisfies those requirements. Under federal law, an eligible child care provider need not be compensated or licensed if he or she is a family member or friend, such as a neighbor who regularly cares for the child. That's where I think I was okay with the reading of that up to that point, but when it went from family member, I was probably okay with as well. But when it went from family member and then they added friend, they went very broad in that regard. So just beware that it's a very broad definition in that regard. And those are the three reasons for childcare. So we have three reasons for the employee's own condition, and we have three reasons for caring for others under the Emergency Sick Leave Act. Employers are going to be allowed to exclude employees who are healthcare providers and emergency responders. Now, this one has been giving me lots of work before the regulations were issued. What is a healthcare provider or emergency responder? Initially, we defaulted to the definition under FEMLA. You don't really want to do that now. The healthcare provider and emergency responder is a very broadly interpreted provision under the law. I will just quickly read the healthcare provider definition because it did surprise me, and it surprised pleasantly many employers out there. So employees who may be exempted from both of these federal requirements by the employer. Maybe. They don't have to be. So let's start with that. If the employer does not want to claim the exemption, they don't have to. That's nice and simple. Most won't, but that is it. It includes a healthcare provider includes anyone, that's the key word, anyone employed at a doctor's office, hospital, healthcare center, clinic, post-secondary educational institution offering healthcare instruction, a medical school, local health department or agency, nursing facility, retirement facility, nursing home, home health care provider, any facility that performs lab or medical testing, pharmacy, or similar institution, employer, or entity. Okay, and then there's some broader definitions even beyond that. So you don't want to apply the definition that we have known since like '93 for what a healthcare provider is. This is very broad. And also when you get to emergency responders, I'm not going to read that definition, but just beware. It is very broad, and if you need the exact language for the exception, I will be happy to email it to you. So we got some new learning to do with new definitions in this regard. And I think the reason initially under FEMLA, we saw it was like a doctor. It didn't say everyone in the doctor's office. And this one time it says anyone employed at the doctor's office. I think the reason they did that is very simple. The office can't function without those individuals. That's the case. Now, this has no bearing on New York State essential employers and who is allowed to stay open. Some of those entities I read to you are going to fall into the essential category. Some will not at the end of the day. Please remember that. Also on essential, the state has stopped processing exception requests. They aren't processing anymore at this time. That could change tomorrow, or maybe they changed it since we've started this webinar. I don't know, but as of right now, that is the case. The state of New York is also cranking up enforcement now. I mentioned to you the Department of Labor complaint page last time. The New York State Attorney General also has one, and now we are also seeing the state attorney generals. I can tell you a little bit about what's happening on the back end now. The employees, or maybe even if it's your competitor who is complaining about you, it ultimately finds its way into the hands of someone at the New York State Department of Law, usually an attorney general. They are picking up the telephone and calling the employer and saying, why are you open? And in one case, a client we represent, they said, you must stop now. We want you to close the doors. We don't think you're essential. How do we challenge that designation? That's what we're trying to figure out at the end of the day. But it's very fluid, moving quickly. Make sure if you are an essential business, there's a couple of things that I do want to tell you just as an aside. Number one, give a letter to your employees saying they work for an essential business and what the basis of the essential designation is. We're also advising employers to put on their door as they enter into the facility, create a little notice. We are open because we are an essential business. Here's why. And please remember, even if you're essential, if you have non-essential employees, you send them home. If you have essential employees that can work from home, you send them home to do the work. You have to do social distancing and other precautions in the workplace to prevent the spread of COVID-19. This is particularly troubling in manufacturing where we have multiple shifts. Some employers are reducing the number of employees on shift. They're staggering meal periods. They've gone to, instead of 2 shifts, 3 shifts to sort of spread the work around so more people aren't in there. They're reducing the number of hours of the shifts to do some deep cleaning in between the shifts. There's lots you have to do in that regard. Just keep all those things in mind. So turning back to the slides, please remember the exceptions here for healthcare providers and emergency responders. They don't have to take the exemption. Most likely they're going to. Okay, so I qualify. I have a qualifying reason under this. What am I paid? So a full-time employee is paid 80 hours of paid sick time under the statute. A part-time employee, what is the average number of hours worked over a 2-week period? And that is sort of what we're going to do. The second one, it seems very consistent with what I told you about last time under state law. Paid sick time will cease beginning with the employee's next scheduled shift immediately following the termination of the need for paid sick time. So just remember these things are here. There are limits and caps that will be imposed in that regard. Okay, payments for sick leave. Now, remember, we went through 2 types of entitlement, the employee's own, or basically assisting and caring for others. So paid sick time because of an employee's own condition, you're going to receive more money, the employee will. The employee will receive the higher of the regular rate or the applicable minimum wage, not to exceed $511 per day or $5,111 total. So there are daily caps and an overall cap that is imposed. And if you are in a situation where the COVID-19 sick leave law applies, it's the order, we have to analyze which way would the employee be paid more under which one. And we've been coming up with some different answers depending on the rate of pay for the individual coupled with their schedule. For paid sick time because the employee is caring for another individual or whose child or for a child whose school or care is unavailable. The employee is going to receive 2/3 the rate the employee would have otherwise received, up to $200 per day, with an overall cap on payment of $2,000. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to say in that regard. I don't think so. Okay, no, not yet. Other paid sick time provisions that they put into the law. Employees are going to be immediately eligible for paid sick time, regardless of how long the employee has been employed by the employer. Okay, so it's a very simple test. It's immediate availabilities. Employers may not require employees to use their paid leave before using the paid sick time. that is available under the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. So just like with the COVID-19 sick leave statute, this is on top of, not in lieu of, your whatever you actually give your employees. And please remember, some employers out there are modifying their leave banks while this is going on. Don't forget HR 101. You have an employee handbook. You are free. It probably says we're free to modify our policies at any time. If you believe there's a policy that could potentially financially devastate you, change it. Okay. I told an employer that the other day. There was silence on the other end of the phone. And they're like, oh, I didn't even think of that. It's just like default to HR 101. The fact that it's an emergency situation, unless we see a provision in the law that says you can't do it, go ahead and do it, as long as you believe you're justified. Okay, so when does some other things, the provisions of the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act will expire on 12/31/2020. That's as it is written today. We don't know how long this is going to last. So I tell people we're going to learn it. I know it may just be short term, and it's causing everyone on this call angst, including myself, but there is a sunset. The sunset is the end of the year. It can always be extended, folks. The rules themselves have been described as temporary. I think that's because there is an expiration. I don't think there's anything that will prevent them from modifying the regulations as we go forward if something is not working, because remember, they threw these together pretty quick. The law says, and now we have the other part here, the DOL has the authority to issue regulations excluding certain healthcare providers from the definition of employee and by allowing their employer to opt out. I've went over that definition with you. I've also explained emergency responder. I didn't read you the definition because it's sort of long, but that is there as well. I've also explained to you the second prong here, exempting small businesses with fewer than 50 employees from these requirements if they could jeopardize the viability of a business as an ongoing concern. So make sure you realize that is a possibility. And let me see if I wanted to say anything in that regard. I'm not sure I did. Nothing of substance jumped out at me other than it's a self-designation in that regard, and you some of the requirements. Yeah, here it is. If you're less than 50 employees, would result in the small business's expenses and financial obligations exceeding available business revenue, and cause the small business to cease operating at a minimal capacity. If these employees were allowed to take leave, the absence of those employees would entail a substantial risk to the financial health or operational capabilities of the business because of their specialized skill, knowledge of the business, or responsibilities. Or, it's an or, it's not an and. There are not sufficient number of workers who are able, willing, and qualified, and who will be available at the time and place needed to perform the work that is needed. So you have to basically document one of those if you're challenged. You have to think about it. Some of you won't. I understand that if you have less than 50 because you got other things to do right now. But I'm telling you, you need to be ready to go. We're going to see rapid enforcement from the U.S. Department of Labor. I talked to our local assistant area director. There is going to be a pause in enforcement through the middle of April, roughly, as we get time to get up to speed on this. I think once the middle of April passes, I forgot the exact date, it may be the 15th or 16th, the enforcement gloves come off. So we have a little grace period here of a couple weeks to get our ducks in a row. I'm going to say that's all you have to do this analysis. You probably already made the decision. We're going to declare ourselves exempt. You have a couple weeks to come up with a justification for it in case the DOL comes knocking, and that'd be the U.S. DOL. And by the way, if they do come knocking, greet them with open arms. I say that in all sincerity. Be nice to them. It will go much farther, and you will have a much easier ride if you do not argue with them. They're doing their job, and that's what they would continue to tell you. We're simply doing our job. You can respectfully disagree with them in their assessment, and you have the right to basically say, I disagree with you, and then they have to decide whether they're going to push the issue or not. But be nice. I've told that to many employers. About a year and a half ago, I think last January, I was going to have to try a case before OSHA. And in the discovery process, they turned over to me the videos that they had made of my client dropping F-bomb after F-bomb after F-bomb to the OSHA investigators when they showed up at the site. The OSHA investigators knew what he was going to do. They took out their cell phones and started recording. I looked at it and said, oh, this is not going to make a good impression to the administrative law judge. And I was right. So be nice. That will get you a long way. You're going to be required to post a notice of the requirements of the law since this has come out. Those have been published. They are on the U.S. Department of Labor's wage and hour website. If you cannot find them, let me know and I will email them to you. Really, there's two, one for federal employees, one is for non-federal, the private sector. So those are readily available. They are there. Do I have to have an employment policy on this? I think it might be a good idea. I was going through the notice requirements in that regard, and it didn't see where that was required. Posting a employment poster for most of you is not going to help your employees because they're not at work. So the government addressed that. An employer may satisfy the requirement by emailing or direct mailing the notice to their employees or posting the notice on an internal or external website. And I think the premise there is that the employee actually has the ability to access that remotely. If they don't, I would email it to them or mail it to them in some regard. So that's the best guidance I think we can give you now. What happens if you as the employer violate the sick leave law? So they have put in their anti-discrimination provisions. So if you take adverse action against an employee or discriminated against an employee who, one, takes leave under the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. So in essence, you hold it against them. They come back, you fire them. You fire them while they're out. Mike, I remember in FEMLA a rule that says in sum and substance, if the employee is out on family leave and I decide to close my business, that's the end of the discussion. That is correct. That is still going to be the rule here. I also remember a rule that if I do a workforce reduction while an employee is out on emergency paid sick leave, that I can lawfully terminate that employee. That is correct. Get ready for the hard analysis. Did you do a workforce reduction of one, just the person that was out on paid sick leave? Did you get rid of people who were injured employees out on workers' comp, out on FEMLA? It has to be a real workforce reduction in order for that to apply. The other thing I always do, and this rule still exists as well, the employee goes out on emergency paid sick leave. Go through their desk, go through their office, see what you can find. When an employee goes out on leave, go through their stuff that is at your facility. Is there anything there that you don't like? And that includes their computer. Are they viewing porn? Are they booking an escort on their computer? Are they dealing drugs? What is it that you find in their office? Is there a weapon? Video the weapon, get the weapon. You can terminate for all those things. So those rules still exist. You just have to be able to justify it to me before I'm going to bless it, because you're going to have to justify it to the government later on. The anti-discrimination provisions also applies to anyone who's filed a complaint or instituted a proceeding under the Emergency Paid Sick Act. has testified or is about to testify in any proceeding under the Act. And since the Act's been in effect for a few days, the only one that's really probably applicable right now is number 1. Number 2 is probably going to become applicable very shortly. Number 3 is a ways off in that regard. Are there penalties for employers who violate the Emergency Paid Sick Act? Of course there are. What would a good employment law be without penalties? Violations of the paid leave provisions. The employee's unpaid wages or overtime compensation are going to be due. So if the employee would have made $4,000 in that regard, and then there's going to be a liquidated damage, which will be, instead of a bill for $4,000, you will get a bill for $8,000. Liquidated damages are generally mandatory under the statute. You have to grovel to get rid of the liquidated damages, and grovel well and be nice and get out in front of it. And employers are sometimes surprised when I tell them we're going to throw ourselves on the sword. And they look at me like, are you out of your mind? You want me to admit I did something wrong? And I said, well, in the first instance, I'm going to admit it for you. It usually works. I tell people that, and they look at me in shock. I said, no, it usually works. Just remember, the department would ask you, make sure this doesn't happen again. So I had a situation just recently where the employer was caught paying people under the table. The department told me, tell him to stop, and we want confirmation from you that he has stopped. I tell the client to stop. The client tells me I'm not doing it anymore. Guess what? Client lied to me. Guess what? The Department of Labor did video surveillance on the place of employment and caught the guy giving out envelopes, basically full of cash, to individuals. So they will catch you if they really want to. In addition to the unpaid wages and liquidated damages, there's also basically an enhanced penalty for willful violation of another $2,000 and change. As to violations of the anti-discrimination and anti-retaliation provisions, typical things, if you weren't hired to begin with, employment. If you were hired, if you were an employee and were fired, reinstatement. Maybe you didn't get a promotion, payment of lost wages, plus liquidated damages, and reasonable attorney's fees. There is a payroll tax credit. The guidance is being rolled out by the Internal Revenue Service. I have seen multiple email announcements of this. I have not read it yet. Myself, some of you may have read it. Employers are going to be entitled to a refundable payroll tax credit worth 100% of the qualified paid sick time paid for each quarter through the end of 2020. The example the department gives for an employee who's unable to work during quarantine, credit for the employee's regular rate up to $511 per day, and the max of $5,110 over a 10-day period. So the devil's in the details. You'd have to work with your accountants on this, but there is this payroll tax credit. Make sure you're doing all the documentation that is going to be required by the Internal Revenue Service. And I read an article this morning that there's some dispute over that as well. But the good news for me is I do employment law and I stay out of the tax world. If it's caring for a family member, the credit obviously is $200 per day and $2,000 in the aggregate for a 10-day period based solely on what the pay is that's going to be available. Eligible employers are going to be entitled to an additional tax credit based on the cost to maintain health insurance for the eligible employee during the leave period. And, we're seeing everything get rolled out by Treasury here. And again, lots of stuff coming fast and furious at us. Under forthcoming guidance, which I do think now is out, eligible employers who pay qualifying sick or child care leave will be able to retain an amount of the payroll taxes equal to the amount of qualifying leave they paid rather than depositing them with the Internal Revenue Service in that regard. So there's an example here that I gave. It's relatively straightforward. You can take a look at it as to payment and how it's going to work. If you have the pleasure of being part of a multi-employer bargaining agreement, the Act does provide sick leave to employees who work under these agreements. Employees who have signed on to these may fulfill their obligations under the law by making contributions to the multi-employer fund, plan, or program based on the hours of paid sick time to which the employee is entitled under the law while working under their respective collective bargaining agreement. As a side note, if you have the pleasure of having a union, the National Labor Relations Board General Counsel, I think, issued a memo this week, some guidance on negotiating during a pandemic. If you would like that, I can give that to you. In essence, there are things that the National Labor Relations Board said, yeah, we get it, it's a pandemic, but if you have the pleasure of having a union, you're going to have to negotiate these things. Okay, let's talk about the other part of the law, the Emergency Family and Medical Leave Expansion Act. And again, I want you to remember FEMLA, but also we're sort of going to forget FEMLA and some of the concepts that you've learned, because it's going to differ now in that regard. You're going to see some overlap now, and there are some regs that clearly explain the overlap on some of these areas. I'll be frank, they were on the 30 pages I haven't got to yet, so I don't have all the details. Entitlement to leave. Employees who are unable to work or telework due to the need for leave to care for a minor child if the school or place of child care has been closed, or the child care is unavailable due to a public health emergency. So I read to you the definition of child care earlier. And, I think the key word there is, it also can include a family or friend, and that's going to be the wild card for you. Now, as I was going through this, there is a provision in here that, can I make some inquiries as to who is available to watch the child? And I think the answer is going to be yes. We're just going to have to follow the regs. So when you get to that point, we'll obviously have the whole thing read by then and digested, and we can guide you through that process. The emergency part, the emergency FEMLA expansion defines a public health emergency as an emergency with respect to COVID-19 declared by a federal, state, or local authority. The president has declared it a national emergency. The governor has issued multiple executive orders. We are seeing county executives do these orders as well. Everything I've mentioned throughout this presentation is building together and is part of this. The devil simply is in the details which one of these laws is going to apply. Unlike the paid sick leave law, which had immediate application to your employees, the expanded FEMLA employees are entitled to emergency FEMLA if they have been employed for at least 30 days. It's 30 calendar days is going to be the look back, not business days. They've clarified that for us. If they've worked for you for 1 week, they are not eligible for the emergency FEMLA expansion. They simply are not. Make sure you look at dates of hire, who is covered, who is not covered in that regard. Unlike FEMLA, which applies to employers with 50 or more employees, the emergency FEMLA provision applies to employers with less than 500 employees. And the count description that I told you about in the first set of slides, those rules are still here. And it also applies to covered public sector employees regardless of the number count. So forget that 50 or more. I've been getting this consistently as a question. An employer hears expanded FEMLA. That doesn't apply to me. Yes, it does. Do you have less than 500 employees in that regard? So the emergency part of this FEMLA extension applies to employers with fewer than 50 employees. Just keep that in mind as you try to develop your overall scheme here with how we're going to come up with it. And, you know, don't be afraid to call and ask for help in this regard, both, you know, anyone that you rely on. I've been calling the DOL folks. They're answering their phones. They're not in the office. They're forwarded. They're answering their phones. They are working remotely, as probably pretty much most of you are as well. This part of the law looks at the FEMLA's integrated employer test. Now, when we're doing this count, we're going to look at 4 factors to determine whether the separate entities are a single integrated employer under the statute. It's going to be very similar to what you read earlier, stated differently, but basically the same. So when we're trying to figure out, you know, you got more than one entity, you got multiple employees, how do we get to this 500? Common management is the first thing. Is there overlap between management and human resources function? I represent one company. They have 6 companies. They have one HR director. She's the HR director for all 6 companies. Boy, that sure makes it look like one employer to me. The vice presidents are vice presidents of all the entities. Again, that makes it look like one employer for me. Is there an interrelationship between operations, meaning are there common offices? So it's very practical. The Department of Labor would say, what companies operate out of here? Not a very difficult question, and you've got to answer the question. And don't lie about it, because my guess is there's the internet. They'll have done their homework already. There's your invoices, your business cards, things that they will easily use against you in that regard. Is there common record keeping, or is the record keeping separated between the companies? Is there shared equipment? Are there shared bank accounts? Obviously, if there's shared equipment, it will count against you. If there's shared bank accounts, it will count against you. If there's common record keeping, it will count against you. But to the extent those things are separate, maybe we are dealing with multiple entities. Centralized control of labor relations. Are the entities sharing policies concerning hiring, firing, terminating, and training employees? Very practical, on the ground, boots on the ground look by the Department of Labor. How do you operate in that regard? And then the degree of common ownership and financial control between the businesses. So you might have multiple entities that are really going to be considered one, in which case you're going to have to, you might get over the threshold, or you might not get over the threshold in that regard. Entitlement to leave, there's an exception, same exceptions as in the other part of the law. Healthcare providers and emergency responders, same definition that I gave you in the first set of slides in that regard. Some other leave provisions under the statute. The provisions of the Emergency FEMLA Expansion Act also end on December 31, 2020. So both these laws, we're looking at a very short window of time. It ends 12/31/2020. It can be extended. So keep that in mind as well. The Department of Labor has the authority to issue regs excluding the healthcare providers and emergency responders. I went over at least the healthcare provider definition with you earlier today, and the emergency responder, it's pretty long, but is there. and exempting small businesses with fewer than 50 whose employees, if they have to comply with the expanded FEMLA, would basically jeopardize the companies going forward. And if you can meet that criteria, you can self-exempt yourself out. At first, I thought it was going to be like an application process. You submit an application to the Department of Labor, and then they'd make the determination. They made it nice and simple. It looks like it's self-exempting. You just need to have your ducks in a row when your employees come and say, well, I want this leave, and you say no. Make sure you explain why. I might even prepare a memo in that regard, telling the employee, thank you for applying for emergency expanded FEMLA leave. We are exempted from this law. Here's why. Be ready to give them a written explanation. I sort of like that approach. If you take what you've learned in FEMLA, you have to give that form to the employee. Your FEMLA leave is denied, approved, etc. And just keep that in mind as well. So we're just building on that. The emergency expanded FEMLA, duration and payment of leave. First 10 days, it's going to be unpaid leave under the law. During this time period, the employee may elect to substitute the leave, but the employer may not require the employee to do so. They may elect, but not required. That's just like our New York State paid family leave. The employee may elect, but the employer may not require in that regard. The subsequent 10 days, the employer will provide paid leave. All right, so let's stop there. This is the first time ever we have seen FEMLA become paid leave. Brand spanking new concept to us. That's why it's an emergency. That's why it's a temporary provision. Mike, does this law change any of the other FEMLA primary requirements? Is it still unpaid? It's still unpaid. None of that changes. So 10 weeks, the employer will provide paid leave at a 2/3 rate of the employee's regular rate of pay for the number of hours the employee would otherwise have been scheduled to work. So there are definitions that they have provided us concerning, what is the regular rate? How are we going to figure out the regular rate? And to be honest with you, it's relatively simple. They're taking all of the definitions that already exist within the Fair Labor Standards Act and saying this is how you would do it. So that is going to be in one of the regulations. I don't think there's anything in there that is shocking to me, to be quite frank with you. So they have a reg on calculating the average regular rate and how you calculate the regular rate for commission tips and piece rates in that regard. The emergency paid leave will not exceed $200 per day or $10,000 total at the end of the day. There are notice requirements that the employee is going to have to give if it's foreseeable. The eligible employee must take leave because of a qualifying need related to public health emergency. The employer must be notified of the leave as reasonably practical in that regard. There is a job restoration rule. This applies to employers with 25 or more employees. If you have 25 or more employees, you must restore employees taking emergency FEMLA to the same or equivalent position when they return from leave without loss of benefits. Same or equivalent position is defined in the FEMLA primary regulations. Not a surprise there that we're going to default back to that definition, but there is a job restoration. Now, if you have fewer than 25 employees, Employers with fewer than 25 employees are exempt from the restoration rule if all the following are met. If all the following are not met, you are not exempt from the restoration rule. The position held by the employee when the leave commenced does not exist because the economic conditions or changes in the employer's operating conditions that affect employment and are caused by the public health crisis during the leave. That's a nice way of saying we did a workforce reduction. We changed how we operated. The business no longer is the same business because of the economic conditions caused by this COVID-19 problem. So that is if you can, that's tier number one. Requirement number two, the employer must make a reasonable effort to restore the employee to an equivalent position. And number three, when the employer's reasonable efforts fails, the employer makes reasonable efforts to contact the employee if an equivalent position becomes available for a period of 1 year, starting at the earlier of when the qualifying need related to the public health emergency concludes, or 12 weeks after the leave commences. So you do have some things to go out into the future. I think that's helpful to you because a claim then is going to be delayed. I don't think an employee has standing to bring a claim until this you've had an opportunity to try to do this. Penalties are very similar to what we see under the paid sick leave. Employers in violation of the provision for providing an additional 10 weeks of expanded FEMLA are subject to the enforcement provisions of FEMLA. And by the way, this is not 10 weeks on top of the FEMLA 12. It's an all-in number based on what I'm reading so far. I haven't got through everything, but it appears to me to be an all-in number within the 1 year period. Back pay, front pay, liquidated damages, attorney's fees in that regard. Employers with fewer than 50 employees for each working day during each of the 20 or more calendar weeks in the current or preceding year are not subject to civil actions brought by their employees. So if you're less than 50, you don't make the determination that the law, you say, no, I'm excluding myself. Let's say you don't do that. The beauty here is they can't sue you, bring a civil action. Oh, that's great. They still can bring an administrative claim against you. So they can still file a claim with the Department of Labor. They cannot sue you straight out in federal court. There's payroll tax credit provisions very similar to the other provisions that we mentioned early on with the mass I put here. So you can take a look at the tax credits, very similar in that regard, and I've given you some examples. I think your best if you go to the IRS's homepage, they have a COVID-19 link right there, and you'll get right into it. As with the other law as well, if you have the pleasure of being part of a multi-employer bargaining unit, this still applies to you. If you have signed on to one of these plans, you can fulfill your obligations under this particular law by making contributions to the plan based on the hours of sick pay to which each employee is entitled under the law while working under the respective collective bargaining agreement. Okay, and I do believe that is the last slide. Okay, so I know over the last 4 hours plus, over 2 days, we've thrown a lot at you. I've also know that in the last 36 hours, we have several hundred pages of guidance that have been rolled out by the Department of Labor, which I still haven't fully read. I haven't got to the IRS stuff yet, and we're still putting this together. Remember, the key thing here is, oh my God, we're already in this leave situation. Yeah, but we got a 2-week window roughly where the U.S. Department of Labor is hands off, meaning they're not going to be pressing us for violations. They're not going to be coming down on us hard as long as you're acting in good faith and trying to figure out what it is. And you may have to drop what you're doing if we start getting these leave requests to figure out, is Johnny entitled? Which of these 3 laws, which one is Johnny asking for leave under? Of these 3 laws, which one is he eligible for? Which one am I a covered employer? And which one? And if I'm a covered employer and he's a covered employee, what are the benefits that flow under these 3 laws? And he gets the greatest of the 3 benefits. It is going to be it's not going to be a simple task right out of the box because we're learning it. And it will, I don't think it's going to be fun, the first few claims you're going to have to process here. And you put that on top of the unemployment, the enhanced payment of $600 on top of the state payment that some employees are going to be getting. It's just a lot for us to put our respective hands around. If anyone wants a copy of the regulations, I can email those to you. If you want a copy of the guidance, I can send you the links to that. If anyone needs the employment poster, again, shoot me an email. I will be happy to send that to you as well. I did a webinar this morning, and I'll end with how I started that one. So we pre-populated with questions. What questions do you have? And these were 2 of my favorite questions. Mike, I'm trying to demystify the requirements. My response, so am I. Another question, which was my favorite, Mike, I have so many questions. Like, so do I. So if you may feel overwhelmed, I get it. I know I owe at least one of you have emailed me a scenario. We're getting you the answer. We got it in the hopper in that regard. Yes, I will be happy to send those links to Emily, and if you send me an email reminding me. So just to do that for me, and I'll be happy to do that, and you can post them. Otherwise, does anyone have any questions on what we covered today, what we covered the other day? I also realize, please realize, this is a moving target. And you can see just the COVID, New York changed just with 3 additional county executives chiming in and issuing orders, and the Onondaga County executive reaffirming the old one and issuing a new one now with some criminal stuff attached to it. So any other questions? Otherwise, I will let you all go. Thank you for your time. And if you think of something, and it's a general question, just go ahead and email me. I promise I will get to it. Don't expect an instantaneous promise, because I turn my email off while I'm doing these presentations. Otherwise, you'd be seeing blip, 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 blip in the corner, and I've been laughing. I never knew employment lawyers would be busy during a pandemic, but we all learned something. Great. Thank you all. I don't see any other questions, but if you have them, please email me. Be safe and have a great day, everyone.